Imagine this. You're crushing every target, breaking company records, and becoming the star employee everyone respects. Then, your boss calls you into his office and fires you. Not for poor performance, not for breaking rules, but because, and I quote, "Your success makes me look incompetent." I'm Stellan, and what happened next will make you question everything you know about workplace loyalty. Trust me, the conversation I overheard the morning after my termination will shock you more than it shocked me. I was 35 years old, working as a senior project manager at TechFlow Solutions in Denver. For 3 straight years, I'd exceeded every target by at least 40%. While my colleagues struggled to manage 2 major projects simultaneously, I was successfully running 5. My client satisfaction scores were consistently above 95%, and I'd personally brought in over $4.2 million in new business through referrals alone. My specialty was turning around failing projects that other managers had given up on. The Meridian Systems integration that was 6 months behind schedule, I delivered it 2 weeks early. The CloudVision migration that 3 previous managers couldn't figure out, I not only completed it, but documented a replicable process that became company standard. But here's where things get interesting and twisted. My direct supervisor, George Walsh, had been with TechFlow for 8 years. He was 42, well-connected with upper management, and had built his reputation on being the steady, reliable department head. The problem? His own project completion rate was barely 60%, and his client relationships were, let's call them, challenging. George had this habit of scheduling department meetings right after I closed major deals. He'd stand at the front of the conference room congratulating the team for our collective success. But I started noticing something strange. In his reports to senior management, my individual achievements were becoming departmental victories under strategic leadership. The Henderson Industries contract, the one I'd negotiated entirely on my own after cold calling their CEO 15 times, was suddenly presented as a result of coordinated team strategy and experienced management oversight. The CloudVision migration, which I'd completed single-handedly over 2 weekend overtime shifts, became evidence of effective resource allocation and leadership direction. But here's what I couldn't understand. Why would a manager sabotage his most productive employee? I mean, wouldn't my success make him look good too? I was about to discover the twisted psychology behind workplace insecurity. And trust me, it's darker than you think.
It was a Tuesday morning in October when George called me into his office. I expected another project assignment, maybe the Harrison Corporation deal that had been sitting on his desk for weeks. Instead, he had HR representative Janet Morrison sitting in the corner with a folder marked Personnel Action. "Stellan," George said, not making eye contact, "we need to discuss your future with TechFlow Solutions." I sat down, genuinely confused. My quarterly review had been outstanding. I just closed the biggest deal in department history the previous week. "Your performance," he continued, "has become problematic." Problematic? I'd literally saved the company $800,000 on the quantum systems project just last month. "I don't understand," I said. "Could you be more specific?" George shifted in his chair. Janet Morrison was taking notes, her pen moving across the paper like she was documenting every word. "Stellan," George said, not making eye contact, "we need to discuss your future with TechFlow Solutions." I sat down, genuinely confused. My quarterly review had been outstanding. I just closed the biggest deal in department history the previous week. "Your performance," he continued, "has become problematic." Problematic? I'd literally saved the company $800,000 on the quantum systems project just last month. "I don't understand," I said. "Could you be more specific?" George shifted in his chair. Janet Morrison was taking notes, her pen moving across the paper like she was documenting every word. "Mr. Adaman, the company has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay and your accrued vacation time." I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, watching George's face. He looked like a man who just confessed to a crime but was trying to convince himself it was justified. "So let me understand this," I said slowly. "You're firing me for doing my job too well? I'm terminating you for not being a team player, for putting individual glory above collective success." As security escorted me to my desk to pack my belongings, my mind was racing. Something about this didn't add up. George was nervous, sweating, actually, like someone who knew they were making a terrible mistake but couldn't stop themselves. My colleague, Evelina Bolden, watched the entire scene from her cubicle. She caught my eye as I packed my laptop, and her expression was pure fury. Otto Rogers, one of our senior developers, actually stood up from his desk when he saw security with me. "This is insane," Otto said, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "Stellan's the best manager we've ever had." But here's what really stuck with me. As I walked toward the elevator with my box of personal items, I heard George's phone ring, and his greeting made my blood freeze. "Victoria, yes, everything went as planned. The problem employee has been handled." Victoria Hayes was the Vice President of Operations. George was reporting my termination to her like it was some kind of strategic victory. What I discovered the next morning would expose a conspiracy so twisted, so calculated, that it would ultimately destroy George's career and everything he'd built at TechFlow Solutions. I spent that entire night staring at my ceiling, replaying the conversation with George. Something was fundamentally wrong with the whole situation. You don't fire your top performer unless there's something bigger happening. At 7:30 the next morning, my phone rang. It was Evelina Bolden, and she sounded frantic. "Stellan, I need to see you. Can you meet me at the Starbucks on 16th Street in 30 minutes? And bring your laptop if you have copies of any project documentation." When I arrived, Evelina was already there with Otto Rogers and two other colleagues, Sarah Mitchell from our quality assurance team and David Chen from business development. They all looked like they'd barely slept. "We've been up all night," Evelina said without preamble, "going through emails, project records, client correspondence. What we found is going to blow your mind." Otto slid a printed email across the table. It was from George to Victoria Hayes, dated 3 weeks earlier, before my termination. The subject line read, "Addressing performance disparities in project management." But it wasn't about my performance being too low. It was about my performance making George's own numbers look terrible by comparison. In the email, George wrote, "Stellan Adamant's individual success rates are creating unrealistic expectations for departmental performance standards. His 40% above target completion rate makes the rest of the team appear underperforming, when in reality, they're meeting industry standards. I recommend restructuring his role to better align with team-based objectives." "Keep reading," Evelina said grimly. The next paragraph was even more damning. Additionally, Adamant's direct client relations bypass traditional management oversight, creating potential liability issues. Several major clients now request him specifically, which undermines departmental structure and management authority. George wasn't just threatened by my success, he was actively working to undermine it. But Sarah Mitchell had found something even worse. "Look at these," Sarah said, spreading out printed reports. "These are George's performance reports to senior management for the past 2 years. What I saw made my stomach drop. Every major project I'd completed was listed under projects successfully managed by department head George Walsh. My name appeared nowhere in the documentation. The Henderson Industries deal, secured through strategic relationship management and experienced negotiation leadership. The Phoenix Medical integration, completed through effective resource allocation and hands-on management oversight. The Meridian Systems turnaround, achieved via targeted intervention and senior-level problem-solving. George had systematically stolen credit for every significant achievement I'd made over 2 years. It gets worse, David Chen said quietly. He pulled out a compensation analysis he'd run.
Based on these falsified reports, George received performance bonuses totaling $47,000 last year, bonuses that were calculated based on successes you achieved. Otto leaned forward. Stellan, he didn't just fire you because you made him look bad. He fired you because your continued presence would eventually expose his fraud.
That's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Astrofocus CEO. Astrofocus was our biggest client, representing about $1.8 million in annual revenue. I'd been their primary contact for 18 months, and their CEO, Rebecca Martinez, had specifically requested me for every major project. Stellan, Rebecca's voice was sharp with concern. I just received a very strange call from someone named George Walsh, claiming to be my new primary contact at TechFlow. He said you were no longer with the company due to performance issues. Is that accurate? The cable went silent. Everyone was listening. Rebecca, I was terminated yesterday, but I can assure you it wasn't for performance issues. That's what I figured. George Walsh spent 20 minutes trying to convince me he'd been intimately involved in our relationship from the beginning. Stellan, I've never heard this man's name before in my life. Every project, every meeting, every strategic session has been with you directly. She paused. I'm calling an emergency review meeting with TechFlow's senior management. If they think they can remove my trusted contact and replace him with some manager I've never worked with, they're about to discover how quickly a major client can walk away. After she hung up, Avelina looked at me with something between admiration and horror. George just made the biggest mistake of his career, she said. He fired the one person holding together the company's most important client relationship. But that was just the beginning. Over the next hour, my phone rang 6 more times. Every major client I'd worked with was calling, confused and concerned about George's attempts to insert himself as their new primary contact. Otto had been quiet, typing furiously on his laptop. Finally, he looked up. I've been cross-referencing George's reported achievements with actual project documentation in our internal systems, he said. What I found is systematic fraud spanning 3 years. He turned his screen toward us. It was a spreadsheet showing reported performance versus documented reality. According to George's reports to senior management, he had personally managed 73% of all major client relationships, directly completed 68% of all successful project turnarounds, and generated 81% of all new business through his strategic relationships. But according to actual project documentation, email records, and client correspondence, George had direct involvement in less than 15% of major projects. His personal project completion rate was 43%, below company average, and he'd brought in exactly 0 new clients through his own relationships. This isn't just credit theft, Sarah said, studying the numbers. This is criminal fraud. He's been stealing achievements, inflating his performance, and collecting bonuses based on other people's work. David Chen was shaking his head in disbelief. No wonder he fired you. Your continued success would have made his lies impossible to maintain.
That's when Avelina's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it, and her face went white. Emergency all-hands meeting at 2 p.m. today. All department staff required to attend. Subject: transition planning and new management structure. George was moving fast, trying to consolidate control before anyone could question what had happened. But he'd made one critical error. He'd underestimated how quickly the truth spreads when you mess with the wrong person. "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked. I looked around the table at my former colleagues, people I'd mentored, collaborated with, and genuinely cared about. George had thrown me under the bus to protect his fraudulent career. Now he was positioning himself to do the same thing to them. "We're going to give George exactly what he deserves," I said. "But first, we need to document everything. By the time that meeting starts at 2 p.m., we're going to have a presentation that will end his career." What we discovered in the next 6 hours would not only destroy George Walsh, but completely transform TechFlow Solutions forever.
Over the next 6 hours, we assembled the most comprehensive fraud case I'd ever seen. Avelina had kept meticulous records, Otto had access to all internal project systems, and Sarah had documentation of client satisfaction scores and feedback that directly contradicted George's claims. But the smoking gun came from David Chen. As business development lead, he had access to revenue attribution reports, documents that showed exactly which employees were responsible for which deals. "Look at this," David said, pulling up a secure company database. "This is the actual source tracking for every contract signed in the past 3 years." The numbers were devastating. Of the $12.4 million in new business George had claimed credit for in his performance reports, he had personally initiated exactly $340,000. The remaining $12 million had come from other team members, with $4.8 million directly traceable to my efforts. "But here's the really insane part," David continued. "George has been billing the company for performance bonuses based on these inflated numbers. He's collected over $89,000 in fraudulent bonus payments over 3 years." Otto whistled low. "That's felony fraud. We're not just talking about workplace politics anymore." Word had spread quickly through the office about my termination. By noon, I was receiving calls and texts from colleagues across multiple departments. Everyone was asking the same question: how do you fire the most productive employee in the company? Sarah's phone rang. It was Jennifer Adams from our marketing department. "Sarah, I just heard about Stellan. This is insane. I've been working with him on the Morrison Industries proposal for 6 weeks. George wasn't even aware the project existed until yesterday, and now he's telling marketing he'll be taking over as primary liaison." Jennifer had unknowingly provided the final piece of our puzzle. George wasn't just stealing credit for past achievements. He was planning to take over all my active projects and claim future successes as his own strategic victories. At 2 p.m., the entire project management department filed into conference room A. George stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation titled Departmental Restructuring and New Leadership Opportunities. Victoria Hayes, the VP of Operations, sat in the back corner, presumably there to support George's narrative about my termination being necessary for team improvement. George began his presentation with what he probably thought was a motivational speech about collective success and moving forward as a unified team. But something was wrong with his usual confidence. He kept glancing toward the back of the room like he was expecting an interruption. He was right to be nervous.
"Before we discuss restructuring," Avelina said, standing up from her seat, "I think the team deserves to understand exactly why our most successful project manager was terminated yesterday." George's face went pale. "Avelina, this isn't the appropriate forum for—" "Actually," Victoria Hayes interrupted from the back, "I'd like to hear what Ms. Baldwin has to say. Please continue." Avelina walked to the front of the room and connected her laptop to the projector. "What I'm about to show you is 3 years of documented fraud, credit theft, and systematic deception by department head George Walsh." The first slide appeared on the screen. Performance claims versus documented reality. The gasps from around the room were audible. The disparity between George's reported achievements and his actual contributions was staggering. "Slide 2, Avelina continued, shows bonus payments received by George Walsh based on these falsified reports. Total, $89,000 in fraudulent compensation." George tried to interrupt. "This is completely inappropriate. I demand this presentation be stopped immediately." But Victoria Hayes was leaning forward in her chair, studying the data intently. "Continue, Ms. Baldwin." Slide 3 documents client relationships. According to George's reports, he manages 73% of our major accounts. Let's see what our clients have to say about that. Avelina played an audio recording. It was Rebecca Martinez from Astrofocus, speaking on a conference call that morning with Victoria Hayes. Rebecca's voice filled the room. "I've worked with TechFlow Solutions for 18 months. Every interaction, every project,
Every strategic decision has been handled by Stellan. I have never spoken with George Walsh before yesterday. If TechFlow thinks they can remove my trusted contact and replace him with a manager I've never heard of, they will lose our $1.8 million annual contract immediately. The recording continued with similar testimonies from 4 other major clients. Each one told the same story. They had exclusive relationships with me, had never worked directly with George, and were confused by his attempts to position himself as their historical point of contact. George was now visibly sweating. "This is a coordinated attack designed to undermine company leadership. I won't stand here and listen to—" "You'll stand there and listen," Victoria Hayes said coldly, "because I want to understand how my department head has been lying to me for 3 years." Otto Rogers stood up next. "I'd like to show everyone something from our internal project management system." The screen filled with a database query, showing project assignments, completion rates, and client satisfaction scores. Every metric told the same story. I had handled the most complex projects, achieved the highest success rates, and maintained the strongest client relationships. "But here's what really matters," Otto said. "The timestamp data shows when these projects were actually managed versus when George reported managing them in his performance reviews." The evidence was irrefutable. George had been systematically claiming credit for work completed entirely by other team members, then collecting bonuses based on those false claims. That's when Sarah Mitchell delivered the killing blow. She'd been quietly working on her phone during the presentation, and now she looked up with a grim smile. "I just received confirmation from our legal department. They've completed a preliminary review of the documentation we provided this morning. George Walsh is being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full criminal investigation for fraud and embezzlement." The room went completely silent.
George looked around desperately, like he was searching for an escape route.
"This is ridiculous. I've been with this company for 8 years. My record speaks for itself."
"Your record," Victoria Hayes said, standing up, "is what we're investigating. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal items. Your access to all company systems has been revoked." As security led George out of the conference room, Victoria Hayes addressed the remaining team members. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe all of you an apology. What happened here represents a complete failure of management oversight. Effective immediately, we're implementing new performance tracking systems to ensure this never happens again." She paused and looked directly at where I would have been sitting if I hadn't been fired. "I also need to speak with Stellan immediately. Someone get him on the phone." 20 minutes later, I was back in Conference Room A, facing Victoria Hayes and the entire senior management team. "Stellan," Victoria began, "I've just learned about the systematic fraud that led to your termination. On behalf of TechFlow Solutions, I offer our deepest apologies and a formal offer to return as Director of Project Management, a promotion 2 levels above your previous position." The offer was generous: 60% salary increase, equity participation, and complete authority to rebuild the department according to my own vision. But the more satisfying than the promotion was what Victoria told me next. "George Walsh has been terminated for cause. He's also facing criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. The Colorado District Attorney's Office is considering additional charges related to the falsification of business records." 6 months later, I was reviewing quarterly reports in my new corner office when Avelina knocked on my door. "You need to see this," she said, holding up a local newspaper. The headline read, "Former TechFlow Manager Sentenced to 2 years in Federal Prison for Employment Fraud." The article detailed George Walsh's conviction on multiple felony counts. His career in technology was over.
his professional reputation destroyed, and his personal life in shambles. Meanwhile, the department I'd rebuilt had achieved record-breaking performance. Client satisfaction was at an all-time high, revenue was up 47%, and team morale had never been better. But the best part? AstraFocus had not only renewed their contract, they doubled it, specifically citing their confidence in my leadership. Sometimes the best revenge isn't plotting against people who wrong you. Sometimes it's simply being so good at what you do that their incompetence destroys them naturally. George Walsh fired me for being too successful. In the end, my success was exactly what brought him down. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever worked for someone who felt threatened by your success? How did you handle the situation? Share your stories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of workplace justice, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Hidden Hearth for more true stories of people getting exactly what they deserve. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.